Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the DGAP morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. My name is Henning Hoff. I'm executive editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. This morning, we will be turning our attention to the G20 summit meeting in Bali, Indonesia, which ended yesterday. Russia's war against Ukraine, which will pass the 9-month mark in 7 days, dominated the gathering in various ways. Russian President Vladimir Putin opted out of attending in person at the last minute and sent his Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov instead, a point to which Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky alluded to when he addressed the assembled heads of state and government by calling them the G19 meeting. In his speech, Zelensky compared the liberation of Kherson last week to D-Day, the Allied landing in Normandy in 1944, which marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War. Whether the comparison is valid or not, Russia seems increasingly isolated on the world stage. The G20 leaders condemned the war and Russia's nuclear rhetoric, including Chinese President Xi Jinping. The pressure is such that it presently seems unlikely that Russia will block the extension of the grain export agreement, which is to expire on Saturday. Russia's response to Zelensky's speech to the G20 was another multi-rocket attack on Ukrainian infrastructure and other civilian targets across the country. While most were shot down, some reached their targets. 10 million Ukrainians were without electricity as a result. One Ukrainian air defense missile went astray and came down in a Polish village near the Ukrainian-Polish border, killing 2 farmers and destroying a tractor. It took some while to establish the facts, during which there was some talk about whether this would constitute an Article 4 or even an Article 5 incident under the NATO treaty. But by yesterday morning, it had become clear that, in the words of Polish President Andrzej Duda, it had been an unfortunate accident, not a Russian attack, intentionally or otherwise. Still, as NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg rightly pointed out, Russia bears responsibility. To discuss the Bali G20 summit, its outcomes and German policy surrounding it, we have 3 excellent speakers with us this morning. I have the great pleasure of welcoming my DGAP colleague, Dr. Claudia Schmucker, head of the Geo-Economics program at the German Chancellor on Foreign Relations. Claudia is a leading expert on trade as well as on all things G7 and G20. She is part of the T20, the think tank 20, which critically monitors developments in this global format. She will assess the Indonesian G20 presidency, the role Russia's war played in Bali, and the summit outcomes. Good morning, Claudia.
Good morning.
Next, we will be hearing from Dr. Shahin Vallée, who has just joined us, a leading economist and commentator and with Claudia, co-head of the Geo-Economics program at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Shahin will be speaking to the macroeconomic challenges the world is presently facing and the ways the G20 have tried to tackle them. Good morning, Shahin.
Good morning.
And last but not least, we'll be hearing from Dr. Tobias Gehrke, who has just started his new role as Senior Policy Fellow and lead of the Geo-Economics Initiative at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Tobias will speak to Germany's new approach to Asia and beyond. As most of you probably know, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz traveled to the G20 via Vietnam and Singapore, where he joined forces with Economy and Climate Minister Robert Habeck, promoting the Asia-Pacific Conference of German Industry. Very warm welcome, Tobias.
Good morning, Henning. Good morning, everyone.
Each speaker has about 6 to 7 minutes for their introductory remarks. We will be opening up for your questions and comments roughly after 30 minutes. For the Q&A, please raise your hand and put your question in person to the panel, or use the chat functions, and I'll try my level best to put the comments and questions to our panelists. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that we have to close on time at 9:30. At this point, I'd like to thank my colleague Milan Nitsch, the DGAP's expert for Central and Eastern Europe, who has been instrumental in organizing these event series. And to start us off, now let's turn to Claudia, please.
Thank you very much for having me. I will focus on the Indonesian G20 presidency, and please allow me a very brief excursion on the role of the G20 before I start to speak about the Indonesian presidency. So the G20 was already founded in 1999, but upgraded to leaders level in the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008. At that point, the G7 was largely seen as inefficient because of its narrow group of only industrialized countries, and the world had come to realize that the G7 on its own was no longer able to address global problems without the involvement of large emerging market economies such as India, China, or Brazil. In the beginning, the G20 were quite successful to address the problems of the global financial crisis, but since then, the outcome of the group has definitely diminished. The first meetings were largely held in industrialized countries. It started with the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada. Germany held the G7 presidency in Hamburg. I think you still remember the pictures we have from the Hamburg summit. Right now, we have a succession of large emerging market economies who will take over the G20 presidency. So this year it's Indonesia, which will be followed in 2023 by India. Afterwards, we will have Brazil, and in 2025, we will have South Africa. So starting with Indonesia, there's a succession of large emerging market economies to hold the presidency. And this is seen as a chance by these countries to make the agenda much more development oriented, away from the interests of large industrialized countries. And this is why the Indonesian presidency plays such a special role for these members. The G20 defines itself as a premier forum for international economic cooperation, and this means it has a strong focus on global economic issues. In this regard, the Indonesian presidency chose the motto, "Recover together, recover stronger." And this is based on 3 pillars. The first one is promoting an even recovery. That was meant to address the post-pandemic economic recovery. The second one is on increasing resilience and stability, which is enhancing macroeconomic and financial stability or sustainable or resilient supply chains. And the third one will be ensuring sustainable and inclusive growth. So in separate work streams, the members talked about securing food and energy supplies, about global healthcare, about sustainability and climate change, and about the digital transformation. But as we all know, the Russian war on the Ukraine overshadows the Indonesian agenda and presidency. The G20 is once again in crisis mode. Henning already mentioned that Biden held an emergency meeting with G7 and NATO allies at the sidelines of the G20 summit after a missile landed on the Polish border near the Ukraine border, killing 2 people. So the question is, how can the G20 react to the Russian war? Different from the G7, which is a values-based group, the G20 justifies itself as a group of systemically important countries. G20 member states account for 80% of the world's GDP, 75% of international trade, and 60% of global population. Therefore, the G7 was able to exclude, or G8 at that point, was able to exclude Russia in 2014 because of its annexation of the Crimea. G20 is not value-based, only based on the systemically important countries, so it has no basis for the exclusion of Russia. Because of the development of the Russian war, the focus of the meeting was on the possible reaction of the G20. So when you read the media, it was all about, can the G20 agree on a final communique? How far will G20 go to condemn Russia? And what will Biden and Xi achieve in their bilateral meeting? When you look at the outcome of the G20 meeting with regard to the Russian war, the G20 were quite successful if you consider the diverse membership. I think Henning mentioned that the G20 agreed that today's era must not be of war and condemned threats to use nuclear weapons, reflecting a rising concern not only by the Western countries, but by other G20 member states as well, about the escalation of the war and the possible implications this had for other countries and the world economy. So the leaders' declaration states, most members strongly condemn the war, But there were other views and different assessments of the situation and the sanctions. And as such, the final communique could be adopted unanimously, which means also Russia adopted this declaration. And this is a huge success for the Indonesian presidency and also for the West. Also, the Indian delegation played an important role in achieving this compromise. So this unified stance, which is much easier for the G7 because it's value-based, that the Indonesian presidency managed to achieve that, that's a huge success. So what about the economic agenda of the Indonesian presidencies? The expectation for the economic outcomes were very low for the G20 summit. The reason is the problems of the global economy stem largely from the war in the Ukraine, rather than, for example, financial problems that led to the global financial crisis in 2008. And as such, IMF managing director said, you can't solve a problem of geopolitics with economic policy measures. Ending the war in the Ukraine is the single most powerful factor to turn around the world economy. So the focus was, and rightly so, on the Russian aggression of the Ukraine. But as I said before, there was a much larger agenda that the Indonesian presidency wanted to achieve. So the question, what about the other outcomes? In general, I would say it is a statement, the statement reiterates previous commitments. So when we look at food security, the G20 promises coordinated action to address food security challenges and welcomes the Istanbul Agreement on grain shipments to the Black Sea. On the climate crisis, the G20 increased their commitment to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. They reiterated the 1.5% goal of the Paris Agreement. This is seen as a success also because it was feared that G20 would no longer back the 1.5% degree issue. So this is seen as a positive development, which might give impetus to the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. On health, the G20 welcomes the establishment of a financial intermediary fund to help other countries and pandemic preparedness, especially for developing countries. On debt, I think my colleague Shahin Vallée will say more about that. There's reiterate their commitment to a common framework for debt treatment. And then on digital transformation, they speak about the importance of digital connectivity and the importance to bridge the digital divide, which will be one of the major points of the Indian presidency next year. So all in all, expectations were very low for the G20 summit. The G20 is in crisis mode, but Indonesia managed to keep the diverse group of industrialized countries and emerging market economies largely together. This was a success, and the condemnation of the Russian aggression was stronger than expected. And with this, I stop.
Thank you very much, Claudia, also for keeping the time so tightly. Can I just sort of one quick question? Would you still think about, would it be right to still think about this sort of this group or the sort of world in general that there's a north-south divide on the war? Or would you say it has sort of been overcome, at least to some extent, by the summit?
There is definitely a north-south divide. If you look at the resolution at the United Nations, there were many countries that abstained, that are also G20 members. But we see a very negative implication for many countries regarding food security, regarding energy prices. So it has become clear for many countries that the war, as I said, is the single most negative factor that affects the world economy and developing countries, or the least developed countries. And I think this is why you saw a rising concern, not only in Western countries, but also in large emerging market economies. So I think the gap was definitely closed through the summit.
Thank you very much. Let's move on now to Shahin with his introductory remarks on macroeconomic challenges.
Thank you very much, Henning, and thank you, Claudia, for this great summary of what the G20 actually agreed and didn't agree to do. I think I will have a slightly more skeptical and critical viewpoint than the one shared by Claudia, in particular on economic issues, where The G20 has been in the past a forum for great progress, and I'm thinking here in particular in response to the global financial crisis, where the G20 was really a venue for major breakthrough. And here I have to say I find the solutions that emerged in Bali somewhat disappointing. And I think the statement that Claudia quoted by Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF managing director, is a good illustration of that. It seems that economic policymakers have kind of given up addressing the macroeconomic challenges and believe that basically it is up to geopolitical issues to be solved first and for the Ukraine conflict to be solved, and that the economic policy will fall back into place almost naturally. I disagree with that viewpoint. I think there's a lot of things that global macro policy coordination could achieve, and which hasn't been sadly discussed enough, neither in Bali nor previously in finance ministers' format. Claudia mentioned rightly that there is a debt framework that is been discussed, but I think beyond that, which has been the focus, there is a number of other things that should have been on the table and haven't been. And I'm going to list three, but I think there could in fact be more. The first one is the question of support to emerging and developing economies, and in particular, the precautionary lines that the IMF could have extended or could still extend to a number of fragile emerging economies. The strength of the dollar, as well as the shock to global commodity prices, puts external accounts of a number of developing countries under tremendous stress, and this is typically a case for IMF action, which I think has been slow to come. The second thing along the same lines, you might remember that the G20 had committed to a large SDR allocation, which was granted in the summer of 21, and then committed to redistribute this SDR allocation towards the developing countries. This repackaging of SDR allocation towards emerging economies and developing economies has been very slow to come around. In fact, only a very small portion of the 100 billion committed have actually been allocated, and there hasn't been a breakthrough at this G20, which I think is a big disappointment. So on these two counts, where the IMF I think was the driving force, the outcome is rather disappointing. A second area of great interest is the potential for FX policy coordination, or more generally global macro policy coordination. And there, sadly, this has barely been discussed. There has been a discussion on these issues in the G7 format, which in fact enabled the Bank of Japan to start currency interventions in order to try and weaken the dollar versus the yen. But this discussion of broader coordinated FX policy intervention, which could have been discussed in a broader format than the G7, has been entirely absent from Bali. And as a result, you start to see risks of financial stability building up in emerging and developing countries as a result of the strength of the dollar. And so this was typically an area where if not the G7, the G20 and emerging and developing economies could have made their voices heard more clearly. And last, but maybe not least, on the trade agenda that Claudia knows very well, there has also been very little progress, and in fact, some issues. Between China and the US in particular, but also issues that are emerging between Europe and the US with respect to the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act have been entirely absent from the community and apparently absent in the discussions. So basically my quick take of this G20 is one of disappointment when it comes to economic policy coordination. I can understand why, the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical challenges have sort of overshadowed economic issues. But I think it's wrong for economic policymakers to believe that nothing can be done so long as there is a war going on. In fact, my view is that it's quite the opposite. It's precisely because there is a war going on that there is even a greater need for economic policy activism and economic policy coordination. And on this front, I think the G20 has been at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahin. The background noise is a little irritating sometimes, but I think that's we just live with it. Maybe just one quick comment, or maybe actually the same question as I put to Claudia a moment ago. Do you still see a north-south divide, and how strong is it, or has it been narrowed as Claudia suggested? Short answer, please.
Well, the short answer is that I think the differences have been papered over in a joint communique, and maybe that's a progress. But I think deep down, and I think this is what Claudia was referring to when she mentioned the UN Security Council resolutions. Deep down, the divides I think remain and are here to stay. Sadly.
Many thanks. Great. Let's move on now to Tobias. He will be talking more about the German approach to this, but also sort of putting it in a wider context. Tobias, please.
Thank you, Henning. And indeed, I'm trying to zoom out a bit and see what happened at the margins of this G20 summit, because as you mentioned in the beginning, there's quite some diplomatic movement of German leadership traveling to Southeast Asia in particular, to Vietnam, Singapore, and now, of course, to Indonesia. I think, sort of, it's quite a positive sign. There's different aims, of course, of trying to engage with these countries. One of the overriding key aims is, of course, diversification, which comes from, which likely will come out of the China strategy as one part, but of course also Russia's war. There's a huge need, as we know, for diversification of raw materials. What kind of new partners can we find there? But also partners in Southeast Asia in particular and Asia are looking for hedging, basically. I think there's a lot of fear of this US-China confrontation and sort of dividing into blocks. So they're reaching out quite a lot, also to look for better partnerships. And Southeast Asia is particularly growing immensely. It has across the board higher growth rates than many provinces in China these days. Vietnam in particular, but also Chancellor Scholz is Germany's most important trading partner in the region. It's a powerhouse in especially low value-added manufacturing. And so, bottom line is that I think it's quite a positive signal that this kind of economic diplomacy is picking up in the region for Germany. But sort of my take is that we should be careful that diplomacy is really just the entry gate. And if we're trying to change or guide economic structures with these partners, that's at the end of the day a material task and not a diplomatic task. And it bears sort of keeping in mind what the United States tried to do in the region in the last 2 years. The United States has been extremely active on the diplomatic field. They have introduced new frameworks like the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There's a lot of sort of ambition of how the United States can cooperate with these partners in the region. And what we hear also, the feedback is that Asian partners are quite pragmatic. They're asking, what can you actually offer materially? What kind of better market access, economic relations can you offer? And the United States has been quite a difficult time offering better economic conditions for these countries. And that had, I think, sort of inhibited its engagement in the region. And for me, that's something that Europe, Germany should try to avoid. So we have to make a good offer. So that brings me to my second point of how, if we're serious about this diversification, also with these partners in the region, how do we actually go about it? And that's quite a big question. But the key is that, unfortunately, I think it's far from resolved in the German approach. We heard a very interesting interview by Robert Habeck in Singapore, where he gave sort of his sketch of how diversification, what the role of the state also in diversification is, what kind of incentives might be necessary. We know that there's some thinking also in the China strategy of how the government could give incentives to companies to actually diversify into other regions that the government likes to do, for example, Vietnam or Indonesia. But Chancellor Scholz also gave a bit of a different angle on this. So there's a bit of an unresolved question sort of between what's the role of the government and what's the role of businesses in diversification, with the Chancellery having a kind of a hands-off approach so far in terms of what the role of the government is. And that is, I think, a really big question also for Germany's engagement in the region, because is it enough to kind of fly in and bring your business delegation to Vietnam, to Indonesia, and so on, and underline that we want to diversify and have secure supply chains? I don't think so, right? There is real, as I said, material realities that need to be put on the table. One is, of course, better market access for these countries. Now, this is easier said than done. There are, of course, also trade agreements, for example, with Vietnam, most importantly, but also Singapore. Trade agreements with Indonesia and Malaysia are famously stuck, and I'm not saying this can be easily resolved. There are serious discussions about how do we manage to have trade relations and keep also sustainability in trade with these partners a strong chapeau. But there's little focus, unfortunately, so far that I can see in the German approach of trying to resolve this and putting focus on how we can actually offer a better trade relations with these kind of very important growth economies. Similar dimension on the investment relationship. These countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, they're looking for major investments, especially in green energy. There's lots of promises in the diplomacy, but so far, I think, unfortunately, not too much forthcoming. We have seen the United States and Japan have managed to set up a major consortium now at the margins of the G20 for Indonesia on green energy transition with, I don't have the number in my head anymore, but quite a significant amount of funding to help Indonesia transition. Unfortunately, these kind of positive economic weapons, if you want to call them, so far underdeveloped from Germany and Europe. There's the global gateway, famously, that's still being stuck. But these are the kind of issues I think we really need to get into. And so the other question is, how do we actually diversify critical supply chains out of China, if that is the goal that might be eventually mentioned in the China strategy, if it ever comes out. And there's also really major questions. China will not simply let go of very high value added manufacturing supply chains. It has a lot of structural advantages. It's providing still for critical or important supply chains major subsidies. It has structural advantages in technology, sometimes in scale. And so, if we're serious about this task of diversifying some of these supply chains, of steering them perhaps to partners like Vietnam, Indonesia, I think there a lot of new policy instruments need to be put on the table. There's one that the German government Robert Habeck is contemplating on investment guarantees. So I hope it will survive and it might be interesting. But there's also a lot of other ideas in the mix at the moment. The United States is playing with incentives. So some of them might be discriminatory, like in the IRA, but there are some real good innovative ideas on the table of how do we actually incentivize supply chain diversification. Japan is playing with several ideas with direct subsidies also. I'm not saying that's the route we should take, but my point is sort of that's really missing in the debate of what can the state provide in terms of incentives and sort of positive economic support in the region to really cement these relationships. And I hope that's coming. You've got to start with diplomacy first, but I hope the next step is really getting into these sort of really material and policy regulatory issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias. We are sort of approaching the half hour line, so keep your questions ready. Start to raise your hands if you want. But same quick snap verdict question to Tobias as well. The aim of the German policy also is very prevalent in the G20, was trying to avoid a world which is sort of splitting into G20 versus the rest. And this also informs, at least I believe, the approach the government is now taking to Asia. Do you think it has been successful so far, or not so much?
I'd say with the statement on Russia in particular, it's quite a significant and successful, perhaps, diplomacy. Bearing in mind that over 60% of world population is on the Russia question in particular is either neutral or leaning towards Russia. So I think it's an achievement in such that the G20 made this statement. But in terms of bloc building in the economic sense, I'm not sure. It's so far to be seen how these relationships with other partners in the region will develop.
Thank you very much. Since no one has raised his or her hand yet, maybe let's go to Claudia again. Shahin is much more pessimistic than you are. Do you think do you share this kind of criticism Shahin has formulated, that sort of on the contrary, the war and the should open space for this kind of international economic management rather than closing it?
Yes, it should. I mean, we have so many crises for the global economy, and the war is one of them. We have the pandemic, we have high inflation, we have high debt, we have the wall of the dollar. I mean, Shahin mentioned them all. So the war is another external crisis also for the economy, and it does make sense to speak about the effects or to help ease the effect of the war. But the problem is that was mentioned before, the war also divides countries. And so especially the G7 needs to make sure that it's not only about them and their approach versus the rest of them. And I think this is why a lot of countries adopted, or also Germany adopted, the approach: we as a country who support international law, and countries who don't support international law, to don't have the distinction between G7 and the rest. But the informal groups, such as G7 and G20, are based on consensus. And this is why any kind of decision making is so difficult. And this is why Shahin is right. We need more coordination on this, but I think it makes it hard in the present geopolitical situation to reach consensus on many of the contested issues that there are. And I'm not sure that the overshadowing of the war prevented possibly some discussions on macroeconomic issues or on debt suspension, which are really high, should be very high on the agenda because they are so urgent, but they did manage to follow up and to have new measures in this regard.
Thank you very much. What I also heard is that some sort of countries developing or in particular still hedge, also because they're not sure whether Russia may not win at the end. Don't you think, Shahin, that's the insecurity that is created around the war is so great that it is while it would be a good thing to make progress, it's very unlikely that this will be happening.
No, I think you're right. This conflict, is creating divides in a number of policy areas where there shouldn't be. But at the same time, it's creating new urgency. And what's, I think, a bit disappointing is that this new urgency hasn't led to a breakthrough on any of the critical areas of policy coordination during this G20. And you could have expected also, I think Claudia mentioned it, that a summit that's taking place, at the same time as the COP would be also a catalyst for a big movement at the COP. And in fact, we are probably seeing the opposite. It looks like this COP is not going to be concluded with a major breakthrough, while you could have expected the G20 to be a catalyst for that. So I think on the whole, we are sadly in a situation where the war has just made international policy cooperation more challenging, while at the same time making it more necessary. And so this is the paradox of the moment.
Thank you very much. We've got 3 hands up now, and I would like to call the 3 members of the audience to put their questions. First is Kimby Olsen, please.
Thank you, Henning, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the very interesting input. I would have a question with regards to the so to say the big players in the room, India and China, particularly what we learned from your perspective. What did we learn about India's and China's approach to the G20? Also, what they want out of it. And I'm asking this, on the backdrop of the upcoming Indian presidency, but also after or in the context of the discussions that Xi and Biden had. So while we were focusing obviously on the European perspective of all of this, what is happening between the great powers out there? So if you can reflect a bit on that would be very interesting.
Thank you very much. Next up is Stormy Annika Milner, the director of Aspen Berlin. Morning, Stormy.
Good morning. And first of all, many thanks for this really interesting discussion and for the whole DGAP series on geopolitical risks. I mean, first of all, I wanted to come to the G20 decision making and the as we learned from Claudia and the other is it's consensus based, and it's a great success that there is actually a declaration and not just a Indonesia G20 chair statement, as we have seen throughout the G20 Indonesia presidency on lots of topics like trade and some others. There was just climate, for example. There was just a chair statement and not a G20 statement or declaration overall. So I agree that that is a success. I still wanted to ask you, because the text got more vague and vague over the years to ensure consensus. If that is the way to go also in the future, or if we could also envision a G20 of different speeds on some top topics with G20 clubs and sub-declarations, so to say, of countries of the willing which want to proceed a little faster on individual issues annexed to a G20 leader statement. If that is something which you would recommend, or rather not, because consensus is more important than anything else. The second issue I wanted to touch upon is also the upcoming Indian presidency, and particularly on trade issues. And we know all the topics which should be on the agenda: WTO reform, the appellate body, dispute settlement, protectionism, subsidies, industrial policy, digital, environment, health. I mean, a really, really, really long list of to-dos. And now we also know that India perceives itself, I mean, as a great chance, this presidency, but it's also a difficult player. Has always been in the WTO, had almost back at the ministerial in Bali in 2013, prevented the trade facilitation agreement. Is a really difficult player on plurilaterals and digital and so on. Health issues, really, really tough. Environmental issues, and Claudia is already smiling. So what can we actually expect from an Indian presidency on trade issues? Just words or also actions?
Thank you very much, Stormy. And to round us off, Philip Herzemenzel with the third question, and then we give it back to our panelists.
Yeah, maybe, thank you very much. Maybe I can just add to that. Rather than having different sub-clubs, would it, maybe just a provocative question, make sense to have yet another club, this time one that's more values-based, and just come to the realization that we do need these formats to talk and to try to come to sort of consensus agreements, but that the countries that share certain values, that share a certain outlook in the world, need a forum as well where they can propose more best-in-class policies, move forward, rather than be hampered all the time. And not so many of these things are about getting your stuff done at home, and we talk a lot about the COP. We talk a lot about emissions somewhere else. But of course, you know, if I look at emissions, then Europe and the United States are still leading, even if China is a big driver on emissions. And we talk about, you know, ending coal power plants somewhere else. There are lots of coal power plants still running in Europe. So would it make sense to have yet another club that's values-based?
Something like a alliance of democracies, perhaps, or is it sort of I don't know whether that's a fair point. I mean, that's one of the ideas of the Biden administration, which so far hasn't has made some progress, but not that much. Okay, let's turn it back to our panelists. Maybe Claudia wants to start.
Yes, sure. I start with the first question of what is happening between the great powers. I mean, that was, as I said before, the G20 was very successful in the beginning, but even though Shahin sees it more positively, I don't think the outcome after the financial crisis were that large. I mean, we still have BEPS and tax and some issues, but I think it could have been more. So the focus is usually on the great powers, what happens when they meet, and less on the final leaders' declaration. And so everything was about Biden and Xi. We know Xi has strengthened his power. Biden achieved to not have a red wave in Congress. So both men were quite successful back home, and it was seen how the relationship would develop in these bilateral talks, which lasted longer than 3 hours. And I think the whole atmosphere between the two was quite positive. And I think, at least what I read, that this kind of positive attitude was sustained by Xi during the entire summit. So he met with Australia. That has been a first for a couple of years. He met with Macron. He met with other leaders of the G20, which shows a very much more outgoing attitude towards G20 members than that we saw before. I think the meeting between the US and China also led to positive, not outcomes, but maybe ending the low tide of the relationship between the US and China. I think Blinken might visit China early next year, which would be one of the highest visits that's going to China. So there's a positive development in the relationship with China. And I think, as I said before, China and especially also India, they said the G7 is no longer valid because we have the G20. You cannot just decide by Western industrialized countries. So I think they really do value this group and they do want to make it a success. So I think the bilateral meetings were important. And as I said, the entire relationship with towards the Russian aggression. Stormy, a success and sub-declarations. I think the value of the G20, what you could see this year is the unity. So if you have sub-declarations, you might have a G7 sub-declaration, you have a sub-declaration by maybe large emerging market economies. I think the value is that this diverse group manages to find compromise on pressing issues. And this is why I would not support these kind of sub-declarations. I mean, we had them, I think, during the Trump presidency, where we had the G19 or the G6 on certain issues because they couldn't move forward. But I would think that consensus is the most important thing. And maybe this connects to the other groups, more value-based groups. I mean, we have the G7, but we see a crisis of multilateralism. And I think the way forward will be more and diverse groups who are willing to move forward. So if you look at trade, WTO reform, yes, it's very important, but the way forward will be plurilateral groups of countries that are interested. So I can see a lot more of these plurilateral groups coming forward on issues that are of common concern for them, where they will move forward. But I would think we still need the consensus by the G20. Indian presidency, yes, India is a very difficult player, especially in trade. We saw that at MC12, where they blocked all major decisions on a number of important issues. So the question is really, what can we expect from the Indian presidency? On the one hand, it will be very much development focused. As I said before, we have this long succession of emerging market economies, and India sees itself, you can see that in the WTO negotiation, as a representative for developing countries. So we will have a lot of focus on food security, on stock holding in food, on exceptions for developing countries, on infrastructure, on technology transfer for developing countries, on debt, on the digital divide. It will be a lot of, it will be very much a development agenda. And as you said, it will be a very difficult partner, but it has the presidency. And this means India wants to have a successful presidency in the end. They all want a declaration. They all want to have real outcomes. So I think that India will try to ensure that there will be agreement on a lot of issues, but there might not be the issues that Western countries will hope to achieve out of the summit.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Shahin.
Thank you. So quickly to Kim's point, I think to me, the important breakthrough which preceded the G20 meeting is basically the clearer line from China on the dangers of nuclear escalation by Russia. And I think this was actually a statement that was in fact secured by the visit of Chancellor Scholz to China, and which was repeated in Bali after the bilateral meeting with Biden. I think that's a very positive development. So that's for the sort of the great power dynamics. Responding to Stormy, I don't think I see a lot of merit in sub-declaration. What I see a lot of value in is something that we have a little bit in the EU, and which I think we could have more in the G20, which is the use of non-papers. And I think you could have on a number of issues, group of countries issuing a non-paper on climate or a non-paper on another topic to sort of put ideas on the table and create a consensus. This may never reach the stage of the declaration, but I think could be useful to the debate and to the conversation. And I think would be, in my view, better than trying to forge an alternative club of democracies or other, which may or may not be united on all issues in the first place. So I think trying to create real coalitions around issues formulated on the paper seems to me a more promising avenue. And then last, I think there was a question in the chat. There are two questions in the chat. One about my first intervention. So my 3 points were on safety nets. And that in safety nets, I put IMF precautionary lines plus SDR allocation. The second was on the debt restructuring and the common framework, and the third was on global FX policy coordination. I don't think my 3 points have been heard completely, so I want to repeat that. But there was a question on climate clubs in the chat, and my understanding is that climate clubs have not been addressed at the G20. And in fact, my view is that because the idea behind the climate club, which was put forth under the German G7 presidency, was somewhat confusing and confused. And I think because Germany has not managed to put out a clear view of what the climate club should be and how it should operate, the idea somewhat died during the G7 presidency of Germany, and as a result, not been taken on in the G20, which I think is a pity, because I think there is some merit to climate clubs, but I think Germany should have made a better effort at defining more precisely what it means by climate clubs. And I think Germany tried to have too many things falling under the categories of climate clubs, and therefore created, I think, more confusion than clarity. So maybe this is something to take on for later, but sadly, I don't think we've made great progress in that front.
Thank you very much, Shahin. Tobias.
Maybe just add one point to what Claudia already said very well on the trade dimension of this. I totally agree that there's already a drift, but even more so for plurilateral agreements that could ideally then lead to something, for example, at the World Trade Organization. So we mentioned all the issues that could be addressed. I would just say that we have this, for example, in the past on industrial subsidies. There were bilateral agreements, but this was really an outdated sort of format. I think with the United States, Europe, and Japan, who also tried, for example, on trade issues to first have a plurilateral among these three major developed economies, and then ideally sort of internationalize this. I think there was an ill-fated approach, perhaps from the beginning. Ideally, this would be situated at a more multipolar level at the G20, where you have a much more diverse set of actors. Now, of course, you could say there's actors like India who would not be willing to engage in this. And on some parts, this is true, but I would also add that, I mean, there's a lot of change also in the kind of conception in Europe and the United States on certain of these trade aspects in green subsidies, for example, to what extent we should, the world trade book, the rule book should allow for states to also come in and guide a green transition. There's major rethinking also, I think, going on in the United States, certainly with the IRA, which is, of course, expanding massive subsidies basically and incentives. And so there is perhaps more room also to have these discussions also in formats like the G20, where that previously were unthinkable. This is more of a long-term thinking, because we are far from having any agreement also in Europe or in America or anywhere on this. But I think, so it's not something perhaps for the Indian presidency upcoming, but sort of midterm, I would be hoping that the G20 is also a catalyst for these kind of topics, trade plus green transition, and how the rule book agreement can be found there. And then ideally that develops into more multilateral negotiations or agreements, such as at the WTO.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for another round of questions. If there's someone else who wants to come in. Dr. Ehringhaus, please.
Good morning. My question refers to the difficult task of diversifying our dependence on China, because we are already dependent. The car industry with 800,000 jobs in Germany depends on the business in China. 300 medical products which we need are produced only in China. And BASF, the chemical company, is building kilometers and kilometers of new factories in China. How does this dependence affect our relationship with the United States? If they consider China as an enemy, if so, they like to put sanctions against companies who do business with China, and like they have done in Nord Stream. So my question, how do you view, what is your opinion? How should we implement this diversification, and how do you assess the risk of the relationship with the United States? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The sound was a little tricky, but I think we got the question. That it's basically the China question.
Yeah.
It's also a question by Ambassador Georg Baumgarten in the chat, where we asked sort of whether this tendency of decoupling from politically risky countries, which I think is mainly China, sort of what kind of a price will this sort of entail, and what follows from it, if I get the question correctly. You're also welcome to put it yourself to the panel. But maybe this sort of de-risking, sort of diversification, friendshoring, all these sort of trends which are we discussing. Tobias already sort of mentioned some of these ideas and policies which are coming up. Sort of how will they, or maybe turn to Shahin first, because I think he has to leave a little early. Is this debate sort of diverging away from China? Is this something which is also prevalent in the French debate, or is it a very German thing which we are sort of concerned with ourselves at the moment?
Well, it's a bigger problem in Germany, given Germany's dependency on China is a lot bigger, and it's a lot bigger than that of any other European country, in fact. And I think it's a true question to deal with this challenge in the medium term. I think we're lucky to have a U.S. administration at the moment which has quite an aggressive line against China, but has not demanded on all of its European partners to follow suit. But we might be in a situation in the future, I'm thinking, post 2024, where we would have a Republican president, Republican Senate and Congress that might be, demanding of Europe to make a decisive choice between China and the US. So this is not the case yet, but I think we will come to that point probably, or at least Europe should be ready to come to that point. And I think the points that Chancellor Scholz made in Germany advocating for a multipolar world are understood. And I think this should be the European line. And I think he's right to defend that line. But we might be, advocating for a multipolar world when the US will want a bipolar one. And that will force hard decisions in Europe. So I think, one way of hedging that is to diversify somewhat with the rest of Asia and to limit our exclusive dependence on China. But I think there is a fundamental political decision at some point to decide whether we will follow the US in a confrontation with China or whether we will try to be in the middle ground for an extended period of time. And I think that decision hasn't been formally made. It seems that Germany is trying to create that space. And I think most of European countries would agree to that. But I think we have to accept that this may mean a more confrontational course with the US administration that would not accept that.
And where would you think is President Macron on this? He seems to be, in a way, sort of doing the similar thing that Chancellor Scholz is trying, or sort of maybe there's one of the few areas where
no, I agree. Even though you're absolutely right. So even though the French and the Germans on this don't have exactly the same economic dependency on China, I think philosophically they are in agreement. I don't think France wants to enter a real confrontation with China, and I think France as well as Germany agree on the need for a more multipolar system. So I think there is great Franco-German convergence on this.
Thank you very much. Claudia, the China question.
The China question. So as we all know, the EU had a new China strategy in 2019, saying China is a cooperation partner, an economic competitor, and a rival. And I think since then, the EU has been rethinking the strategy, saying these all three things are still valid, but it's more about the rivalry. When you look at Germany, we see a slightly diverse development. As you mentioned, we have large companies such as BASF, such as the car industry, which is very dependent on the Chinese market. I think every fourth car is sold in China. What you see here is more investment in China to separate the supply chain, so that if you have a shock coming from the US or from other areas, you will have an independent supply chain within China, Chinese production for the Chinese market. This is why you see a lot more investment by car manufacturing and by BASF in China. When you look at smaller and medium-sized companies, they are more hesitant. They want to reduce their dependency on China and diversify to other countries. But the question always is, what is the alternative to the Chinese market? I mean, you still have Vietnam or Singapore and a lot of ASEAN countries, but you hardly have a market that's as huge as the Chinese market. And Tobias mentioned that what the German government is now doing or wants to do is please factor in the geopolitical risk. We do not prevent you from investing in China, but we will not support it through insurance measures. So you have to factor in the geopolitical risks. In the US, it has a very different perception. So in the US, China, in its national security strategy, it says China is a country that wants to overturn the international order that we have right now, and it's the only country that is able to do so. So United States has a completely different approach to China than Europe. Basically, what we do have is the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, which nobody says openly, but it's all about China. It's all about how to connect the US view or the US measures with European measures. But it will become more and more of a problem because we have an entity list, we have by the United States, we have tariffs. And I think the way for the EU to keep a middle ground will become much more difficult in the future, because the US has a very strong view on China, which is very different from the European view.
Thank you very much, Claudia. There's a late question by Milanic. Just get him in, please, Milan.
Thank you, Henning. As somebody who is not dealing with these issues, I have a question to Claudia. Please help me to understand if after G20 summit, whether we have more optimistic outlook on globalization, amidst global trends that were running, in my understanding, against globalization, and that there was much more sort of fragmented multilateral order and very bad prospects for climate talks, for global digital infrastructure, the whole list that Stormy mentioned, what needs to be done, doesn't look good. On the other hand, there was a declaration, and you mentioned the series of presidencies coming, India and others, either from Asia or from even Africa, which looks good for globalization, multilateral order. So help me to understand where we are in your outlook. Is the multilateral system sort of holding on, and G20 helps, or it's more mixed picture?
Thank you very much, Milan. Maybe very quickly to Claudia, and then Tobias has the last word.
Yes, thank you, Milan. I think we have a more positive outlook, because they mentioned, we mentioned to avoid this picture that we have the West on the one side and the large emerging market economies on the other side. So I think it gave a push to multilateralism, but then when you look at the fora where things are negotiated, when you look at the COP or when you look at the WTO, this interest or the national interest still prevails. So it mentioned in the G20 declaration all the problems you have at the WTO, like about the waiver for vaccines, the extension of that for therapeutics and diagnostics. So even though we have this common declaration in the G20, you still have very strong national interest in the multilateral fora. So it waits to be seen whether the G20 declaration can help push for more reform, because it's a very vague declaration. It mentions all the different interests that there are in the different fora. So I'm not sure it will help that much, but it was good that it is there and that countries united. But I'm not sure it's a major push.
Many thanks. And Tobias, maybe also on the optimist pessimist question.
Yeah, I would agree with Claudia. I would just add that next to G27, I think the Xi-Biden meeting was really also, in a way, a positive kind of valley of the negative maybe we have reached. It looked quite positive, especially if we compare it to how things were during the Cold War, because there's a lot of talk about Cold War approaching between the United States and China. And but if we look at the kind of the meeting outcome of President Xi and Biden, it's far from where we've been during the Cold War. Of course, it's problematic in a lot of sense, but there's also still room where both agree, they try to cooperate. So I think there is something positive to take out. Maybe on a last final note, I know this is a bit far off topic, but because it was also asked on the dependency, I just want to maybe have one remark on this still, because for me, there's two discussions going on at the same time on this dependency. There's so many different kinds of dependencies. There's really dependency on critical supply chains and the more general dependency that Germans export or Germany's economy has, for example, on the Chinese market. I believe that even though the Americans are still far more combative, of course, on China, is that the real problem is the critical dependencies. It's not necessarily the fact that BASF is building a plant there, or Volkswagen is getting a lot of its profits in China, because a lot of American companies do too. I do believe, as Shahin said this, not new president comes in, this will be a problem in the future. But so far, I think the debate is relatively clear in the sense that please identify critical technologies, 5G ports, semiconductors, and that's where the Americans are pushing on Europe, on Germany, to kind of work on that. So I think there's not so much a huge split yet, but I think that could spiral out of much worse with the new presidency, certainly.
Thank you very much, Tobias. I think we can all agree the first summit of the second Cold War, it wasn't in Bali, and I think that's definitely a good thing. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Claudia Schmucker, Tobias Gehrke, Shahin Vallée, who had already had to leave us. I hope you join us again next week, and I wish you a very good morning.